Okay, Samir and Sienna, if you'd like to join us, make sure everybody's here and okay, there we are. Welcome everybody to tonight's Chaucer's Books virtual talk with author Sienna Craig. My name is Michael Takeuchi. I'm the events coordinator at Chaucer's Bookstore, an independent bookstore based in Santa Barbara, California, that was founded in 1975 by our current owner, Mari Curley. To purchase tonight's book, The Ends of Kinship, Connecting Himalayan Lives Between Nepal and New York, look at other books, check out future events, please visit our website at chaucersbooks.com. While our guests, moderator, and myself will be the only ones visible and heard on this webinar, we do have an active Q&A function to answer questions on your screen. It's at the top of your screen. Just look up there, it says Q&A. Time permitting for the event. So let's begin. To introduce our guests and to run the show, I am pleased to introduce author in the University of California at Santa Barbara, Professor of Asian American Studies, Samir Pandiya. Samir is not only a great friend of Chaucer's, but his recently released novel, Members Only, is one of my favorite books this year. So take it away, Samir.
Right. Thank you. You can hear me? Yes? All is
Yes.
good? Hi. Hi, Sienna. How are you?
I'm well.
Is it cold in New Hampshire?
It's actually unseasonably warm tonight. So yeah, we still have leaves, and I see some of my students and former students. Hanover is good, but we miss you. So
excellent, excellent. Thanks, Mike, and thank you, Chaucer's, for hosting this event. And hello to all of you out there. I think I can speak for Sienna and I both that we wish we were doing this all in person, because I think the best part of publishing and writing and finishing a book is to see all your friends and spend time with them. And so that is the kind of the genuine gift at the end of the process. But you know, what I thought I would do today is I was going to give a brief introduction of Sienna, and then I was going to ask her to talk a little bit about this terrific book called The Ends of Kinship. I'm going to hold it up. It is a really beautiful, lovely book, and I hope all of you get a chance to pick it up. We are going to talk for about 30 minutes, and I would urge you all, as many of you, to throw in questions in the Q&A, and I will try to go through them. Mike is going to try to go through them. And so we're going to talk for about half an hour, and then we'll take questions from you, and then we'll give you a little bit of time to get yourself a stiffer drink if there are other things that you want to view for the rest of this evening. I don't know what that would be after Sienna and I are done. I think we will have taken care of everything you need, but in case you need to go listen to something else, there'll be plenty of time to do that. So let me just quickly tell you that Sienna Craig is an associate professor of anthropology at Dartmouth College, specializing in medical and cultural anthropology. And in particular, she's interested in questions around global health. She's the recipient of multiple grants from the National Science Foundation, and more recently, the winner of the extremely prestigious John Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Award. She's the author of multiple articles and essays and books. And I just want to mention two of them. In 2012, she published Healing Elements, Efficacy, and the Social Ecologies of Tibetan Medicine. And she has just published this wonderful book called The Ends of Kinship, Connecting Himalayan Communities Between Nepal and New York, the book that we have gathered here to talk about today. So I have all sorts of questions. I think you all must have all sorts of questions, but I'd love to hear first from you, Sienna, for you to talk, for as long as you want, about where this book came from, what the process of it was, anything you want to say about kind of what kind of is a larger set of ideas that you're trying to convey in the book.
Sure. Thanks so much, Samir, for that kind introduction too. As an anthropologist, but also just as a human being, I've very much been shaped by the, at this point, 27 years of friendship and relationship that I have with people from a small region in the Himalaya, at least one of whom is in the audience, hi Lakpa, called Mustang. And I first went to Mustang as a 19-year-old undergraduate student studying religion and anthropology while I was in college. And needless to say, that first impression and the first experience of field work and being hosted by and welcomed into the lives of people from Mustang transformed mine and gave me a sense of direction that I didn't even know I had or needed, but that has continued in various ways through the course of my life. And also has sort of stood the test of time as people near and dear to me from this part of the Himalaya have made their way to the States and have made their way to New York City, which in many ways could not be more different than the High Himalaya, where Mustang is located, right on the border with Tibet. And so at some point, as you know, so the book in a way catalogs these more than 2 decades of relationship, but it also reflects more recent research, both in New York and back in Nepal, about a whole range of things, from work I've done on women's reproductive histories and women's lives, to work that I've done in different collaborative forms with friends and colleagues from Mustang and other Himalayan regions, living and working in New York and working hard to continue to preserve their language and culture in those contexts. So at a certain point, it became clear to me that I couldn't know Mustang or do work in Mustang and not do work in New York, and not try to understand the relationship between these two places. And I guess the other thing I'll say as a framing is, and for those who are part of the academic universe, this is very much a post-tenure book in the sense that it's really the book I wanted to write. It's a book that combines short fiction, so short stories, with narrative ethnography as a way of telling these really complicated and beautiful stories about how people move, what that means to them and to their families, how you sustain senses of connection across these very vast domains of time and space. And, you know, in many ways, I also wrote this book for the generation, like my friend Lakpa, who's here, who are growing up in a way and becoming adults and stewarding their culture between worlds, between their parents, many of them who are still living back in Nepal, some back in Mustang, and their own lives and their own dreams in New York. And so that's really one of the key motivations for writing this text, and for writing it in a way that hopefully is going to be interesting for people to read and not fall into the trap that too much anthropology does, and not really bring the stories alive.
You know, it was a question I was going to ask you later, but I think you've created a great segue to it. I mean, one of the first things I wanted to say as you were introducing this is, I was just trying to think that it is such a unusual tradition that you would follow in some ways your subjects for as long as you have, right? There's such a kind of, there's a way in which if a historian looks at an archive, they look at different kinds of archives in a different way, right? And so that your relationship to archive is so different is because you are in some ways, you are kind of seeing people grow up. You're seeing people move across the world. You're seeing kind of migration, all the kinds of larger issues that we talk about in anthropology. You're seeing them kind of as a progress as it is happening. So let's talk about, you know, what I found, of course, as a fiction writer, what I found so intriguing about this book, or one of the things I found so intriguing about this book, is the way in which you kind of bring together kind of deep analysis, narrative ethnography and short fiction, right? That in a way, that is literally how you have structured this book, where each of these bigger chapters kind of works from that idea, right? And I want to quote something you said in the introduction. You said, as a method and form, fiction reveals the strengths and limits of ethnographic knowing, specifically when it comes to fostering empathy and curiosity, right? So you have been doing this for a long time, right? And so maybe I'd like to hear, as an ethnographer, what do you think are the strengths, and then what do you think are the weaknesses of that particular form?
Well, I mean, there are so many things to say on that. I guess one thing I would say at the get-go is that, and this relates to something else that you just said, Samir, about sort of the longevity of these connections. I very much feel that, you know, at some level, sure, the people that I'm writing about are my subjects, but they're very much also co-creators of this knowledge and collaborators and friends. So in a sense, I think part of what can be limiting about more traditional ethnography is that sense of distance that at least historically, for a range of reasons, my discipline, anthropology, has fostered. And I think that, you know, personally, the more that we can do to break that down and rearrange it into a recognition that all knowing is partial, whether it's ethnographic or fictional or scientific, and it's imperfect, but it still is worth doing. And, you know, I think that for me, the part of the relationship between fiction and anthropology was a way, on the one hand, of writing, of paying deep attention to how I was telling these stories, and also living with and sort of writing through different forms of confidences that are entrusted to me as a friend, but also as an ethnographer. And I thought fiction, at one level, it's an aesthetic choice, but at another level, it's an ethical choice. It's a way to hold and share stories without, you know, some of the ways that traditional ethnography might feel like putting people on the spot or outing them in ways that might not be, again, their own way of representing themselves. And this is, again, a constant tension in almost anything, but I would say especially in the history of anthropology. So fiction allowed for a kind of imagination of the inner world and inner life that traditionally ethnography doesn't engage in, or doesn't engage in as much. And yet I think to try to understand sort of the full picture of social lives and social change, to me anyway, I think it's useful to use both. So, you know, fiction, and I think I say this somewhere in the book too, fiction is a way, I think, to get at social truths, just as ethnography is a way to show how everybody has blind spots, and yet also everybody shines a light in certain ways on aspects of their culture that really matter to them, and aspects of their struggles, the kiduk, the, you know, happiness and suffering of everyday life that we go through. So yeah, that's some of how I've thought about that relationship.
Yeah, and it is, you know, there's a phrase that you used, right? I mean, there are a couple of things that popped up was about the ethics, right? The ethics of your own storytelling, the ethics of taking someone else's story, right? Which is in some ways, in the last, what, you know, in the kind of the self-conscious turn in anthropology, that has been a central part of our conversation, right? Which is that let us be careful with kind of how we are doing this, right? And how we are, you know, kind of engaged, that this idea of a native informant is kind of creating a certain kind of distance between the anthropologist and the people that the anthropologist is studying, right? You use this great phrase, right? Which is that we are co-creators of knowledge, right? And what I found striking about this book is the ways in which you use this notion of Cora that you use throughout the text to serve as a kind of really interesting theoretical structure for the book, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what I appreciated particularly is the ways in which you talk about this idea that within anthropology, that it becomes legitimate when you bring an outside theory to make sense, right? So that in some ways, if this was a Freudian read of, you know, of Mustang, we would kind of disagree with it, but it would bring a certain kind of weight to it, right? And so tell us about kind of what this term Kora is and why it was so important as the kind of the theoretical basis of what you're doing in this book.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. And the way that I use this English gloss, K-H-O-R-A, Kora, in the book is really to talk about two different terms from Tibetan language and culture, but that go together or that fit together in important ways in how I came to understand migration as a process. And so one of the words is kora, which literally is the circumambulation, right? It's what we do around a sacred space, like the stupas in Kathmandu, or around a temple or a monastery. So it's a walking around and a walking with in prayer and in different forms of conversation. Korwa, this is the second word, and that means essentially it's samsara, as it would be translated in Sanskrit, but or in sort of contemporary parlance. It's cyclic existence. It's the cycle of and the movement between birth and all that you go through in life, and death and transformation. And as I was, you know, thinking and reading through notes and talking to lots of people from Mustang over the course of many years, both of these concepts continue to be voiced in conversations with people that I trust and I care about how they were making sense of what it was they were going through in these cycles of migration and movement and diaspora. And so to try to sort of do justice to those culturally Tibetan ideas as a way of framing a larger conversation about migration and mobility, I chose to structure it around this term, which again is sort of glossed in English as K-H-O-R-A, but draws on both of these really core concepts. And you know, Freud or Foucault or whoever it might be, you know, part of what I wanted to resist by doing that is something that has a long and troubled history in anthropology, which is basically saying all the cultural stuff that you get from field work or that you learn about a people or a place, that's all fine, grist for the mill for description, but you know, to make sense of it, we need to go to Europe. We need to go to white male continental philosophy. And I feel very strongly that we don't. And I think that, you know, Tibetan culture has so much to offer the world in terms of a way of thinking about how we are human beings with each other. And Kora, again, was a way to privilege not only what people that I cared about in writing this book were thinking with and talking about, but also as a way to say, you know, there's a small c Catholic, you know, a more universal meaning and sensibility that we can get from thinking about the Kora of migration and thinking about how, you know, the ethics and the daily practice and the affective and sensory experiences of movement between countries, between continents, and who we do that with. And so, yeah, so that's sort of how I came to that set of ideas. So it really did come from what people were saying to me and wanting to privilege a Tibetan and Mustangi and Himalayan sensibility about how they make sense of their lives.
Yeah, and you can see where kind of then the kind of the blending of fiction and ethnography kind of operates particularly well within that space, right? And I mean, I remember, you know, the great historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, you know, of colonial India. One of his early, you know, he has this great notion of provincializing Europe, right? And he has this line that really stuck with me when I read it in graduate school, where he said that I have spent my career footnoting great European cultural historians, but they have never felt the need to reciprocate. It's a striking moment, right? Which is, he is saying that for me to legitimize the way in which I talk about Indian colonial history, I have to talk about kind of French cultural history. but French cultural history does not need me to legitimize itself, right? And I think that that is kind of what I found striking about what you were kind of working through here, right? Which is, how is it that, you know, you both kind of think about this history, let that history stand on its own, and then in some ways, as the writer, as the ethnographer, as the scholar, also get out of the way, right? And kind of what that means and kind of what it doesn't mean. You know, it's funny because when I kept looking at the title of your book, I kept thinking it was, when I first saw it, I kept thinking it was The End of Kinship. And of course, it's not the end of kinship, right? And of course, it's a very different connotation to add the S. So tell us about the different connotation in adding the S and what you were up to in this notion of ends as opposed to end.
Yeah, that's an important thing too. The ends of kinship are not at all a stopping point. I think too often when we think in different ways about cultural change, there's this notion that it's linear, or that it's, you know, it starts and stops in certain places, or that if it transforms, then somehow, you know, you get this very tricky word, authenticity. It's somehow no longer real, or it's no longer authentic. And of course, anthropologists and novelists and, you know, lots of us know that not to be true from our own experience, but we tend to think about it in that way. And so the ends of kinship are really not at all a singular end. They're about these circles and cycles and how we tie up, shore up, restitch the relationships that are important to us over time. And, you know, ends can signify so many things. They can signify particular points on the map, a village in Mustang, a neighborhood in Elmhurst in Queens, and how they relate to each other. But the ends are also, again, about those spaces where relationships, like the end of a rope, begin to fray, and you have to figure out what to do with that and how to repurpose it into something that works in the current context. And so, again, the ends of kinship is about that process of making and remaking home, belonging, family, and different forms of connection. And although, you know, in many ways, the friends that I hold dear from Mustang are the family I've chosen, you know, I certainly feel the ends of kinship with my own family in California, that, you know, and COVID has, of course, heightened all of this, but it's this sense of needing and wanting to keep holding things together, and to tying and shoring relationships up, even as things continue to shift and morph and change, and the tapestry, you know, gets unraveled in a certain point and has to be remade in another. So that's really how I'm thinking about that term, and thinking about how it relates again to this idea of cyclic movement as opposed to a linear trajectory of what being a migrant or living in and through diaspora means. Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that from someone who spent some time in Queens, the ethnography of, I found that part, of course, particularly interesting, you know, and of course I loved all of it, but I had a couple of questions kind of about that. And I want to, in some ways, part of what this book is, in terms of when you were talking about the ends of kinship, is that this is a book about migration and about the process of writing an ethnography of migration, right? In the sense that I think in our traditional, or one's traditional notion, and I think that traditional notion has broken down very significantly, but, you know, in the version of the Intro to Cultural Anthro class you teach, right? There's an earlier tradition of, you know, Evans Pritchard or Malinowski going where they're going to go, kind of engaging and then coming back, right? And you were doing something very, very different. And so I guess what I'm curious about, what's the experience of writing an ethnography of migration? What does that feel like when you're trying to kind of basically follow a group or family or individuals across 10,000 miles?
Well, WeChat has made it a lot easier. I say that sort of in jest, but I mean, you know, that everybody is and for those of you who don't know what WeChat is, that Trump has sort of made it infamous. It's, you know, one of the social media platforms that began in Asia and that in China, and that many people here from Asia use to communicate with each other. This is just to say that, you know, worlds are simultaneous, right? That to think about what it means to be studying or thinking about changes in Mustang also means understanding how messages and experiences are traveling themselves between these places, even if people are now, especially during COVID, stationary. You know, they're not able to move. And before COVID, all sorts of things shape whether or not people can continue to move. Papers, politics, money, you know, all of that shapes, in a sense, stories of migration in really profound ways, and in ways that again reflect my own position as, you know, as someone who is not from Mustang. You know, I have walked Kora with many people from Mustang. I will never walk in their shoes. You know, in this sort of space of migration. And I very much recognize that. But I think what it's, you know, writing a story of migration has also done for me, and this actually connects in many ways, perhaps it resonates with some of your work, is I have learned, I would say, as much about how to write about and think about 20th and 21st century migration from reading literature than I have from reading contemporary anthropology. So, you know, many writers from the wonderful Tibetan writer Tsiriwang Modompa, whose work has really shaped how I think about different aspects of Tibetan cultural life, to many other people, Richard Blanco, Jhumpa Lahiri, lots of people writing about these kinds of experiences of movement, belonging, care, and connection through the exigencies of or the push and pull, you know, that drive people to move, right? Whether it's political violence or economic opportunity or education or some combination of all of those things. And so I think I've learned, yeah, I've enjoyed and learned as much from reading, or Teju Cole is another favorite that I read a lot while writing this book, you know, trying to think about also how people from Mustang are moving through the world. The novelist Nadim Aslam has this great line about, you know, you pull a thread, and this related to the ends of kinship too, that you pull a thread in one place and it ends up, you know, almost anywhere. And I found that to be true as I've thought also about what it means to write a story of migration. I've met people from Mustang on train platforms in Lisbon and in Parisian cafes and you know, places far beyond New York, and just that recognition in that sense of different kinds of histories of movement have contributed to sort of how I've thought about both the aesthetics and the kind of social practice and moral practice of trying to figure out how to write this book.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating, it's interesting, right? Which is that if we think of migration as an idea, right? And in terms of kind of how the different disciplines engage with it, right? And in a sense, I think that you're right that in a way it has become such a subject of kind of literary engagement, right? Like all the people that you talked about, I've been revisiting W.G. Sebald, you know, the German writer who writes precisely about kind of the migration of Germans after the war. And, you know, I will just say that if you all need one book or After the Ends of Kinship to read, you know, Sebald's first book, The Immigrants, is precisely about, I think, what Sienna is talking about, right? Which is that in a way that the novel becomes not necessarily a first draft of this experience, but certainly a deep archive of this experience, right? Which is that these are in a certain way, I have been thinking about kind of this experience of COVID and what it is like to write in this era, and how it is that we can write and not engage with this era, right? Like that, are we moving forward going to be able to do anything that does not reflect back on this collective moment that we have all globally had, right? Which is that in a way, it is a that kind of Benedict Anderson notion. It's a pure imagined community that has occurred, right? With all of us experiencing this. And so it is a kind of an interesting kind of space to go into, right? And I think that those of us who've been kind of engaged with ethnography and literature as in some ways like disciplines, right? Like kind of forms of narrative, I think we see this, right? That the ways in which people narrate their own movement versus the ways in which we kind of narrate our movement. And I think that that has been so central, right? Because I mean, in a way, you were bringing up WeChat, right? That in a certain way, the very notion of kind of leaving your family behind is radically different in 2020 than it was even in 2010, right? Like the ways in which how quickly you can communicate. And, I had lost kind of my aunt's phone number who lives in India, who's 85. And I realized that I was Instagram friends with her daughter, and I just videoed them and they picked up the phone, right? Now, that seems like a random example, but your relationship to kinship is very different when there are these technologies available that make it available very quickly. I want to urge folks, I have all sorts of things to say. And so, but you really don't want to hear me kind of ask all of these questions. So please, if you have questions, I would love for you to put them in. I am going to ask Sienna one more question as you are putting your questions in, and then I will take a look at them. You've spent a lot of time in this particular part of the world, yes?
Yep.
Is there a part of you that wants to go entirely somewhere different for another project? Say, I in recognizing that there's limits to your knowledge, but in a way that a novelist suddenly wants to go kind of paint. Is there a very different place that you would have in mind as something that you would want to explore as an ethnographer?
It's funny. At some level, sure. In fact, there are places much closer to home, and COVID has made me think about that a lot. That would be, I think, really interesting spaces to learn about and to work with people. Here or much closer to home. I will never get bored or tired or anything of going to Mustang and going to Nepal. I will always be a student of these places and their languages, and so there's always something new to learn there. I would say, and this speaks to a couple of my students who are in the room, so to speak. I've had the good fortune of spending about a year of my life, I guess, in the last 7 or 8 years in Aotearoa, New Zealand, teaching there, basically teaching Dartmouth undergraduates there, and being a student very much of Maori history, culture, language, and also of sort of what critical Indigenous studies can look like. And I don't know if I would ever necessarily want to do a big research project in New Zealand, although I think it would be a really interesting thing to think about or to collaborate with folks there on. It's a place that has come to really mean something important to me, and I guess that's the thing I would say in a general sense, is that for me, being an anthropologist and being a writer is fundamentally about the people and relationships that are at the core of those experiences and how we've impacted each other. And so I think I don't really have a strong desire to sort of just pick up and go somewhere else. I'd much rather keep building with the roots that I have in places. And I think, again, that just comes from recognizing, you know, how much I still don't know about Mustang 27 years later, and, you know, like how long it does take to really to feel even remotely confident in a sense of knowledge and storytelling in that way.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have some terrific questions. The first one I'm going to give you from Mary Hebner,
My mother.
your mother. Hi, Mary. Mary asks, can you talk about the way Mustangis and others dealt with the big earthquake, how they pictured that event and then dealt with that event in terms of distances and also connecting via concepts of Kora?
Yeah, so, you know, Nepal experienced 2 massive earthquakes in the spring of 2015. And there were a lot of different ways that that people dealt with those moments. One of the ways was, you know, a lot of fundraising, basically, and trying to send money back to Nepal in different senses. And it created, I would say, a set of opportunities for young people from Nepal in general, but, you know, including people from Mustang who were living in New York, to figure out, to feel the distance in hard ways, I would say, but also to figure out how they could be engaged in efforts to help in the aftermath of this event. And, you know, one really interesting thing, so there are strong social service organizations for many Himalayan communities in New York, including those from Mustang, and they raised a lot of money that went not only to their own communities, but also to other Nepali communities. And that, I think, was, again, a very interesting moment that might not have happened in quite the same way, or didn't happen necessarily in quite the same way in Nepal, although there was a lot of, you know, Nepalis from different parts of the country learning about each other's plights and supporting each other in ways that hadn't really happened like that prior to the earthquakes as well. But one of the ways I tried to be involved in that moment with people from Mustang was to be part of a project that was actually just listening to people share their stories of the moments that the earthquakes occurred and what it meant to them and how they made sense of it. And so actually, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read a teeny bit from, this is actually from a short story called Gods and Demons, but there's it sort of speaks to some of this in a way. And this is taking place in Brooklyn in 2015 in the story. A young man named Yutok who is struggling with being away from home. In the aftermath of the earthquakes, Yutok had a hard time turning away from social media. Like so many other Nepalis, he is worried for his family, but he's also fascinated by the ways people talk about these events, how they try to explain, as if that would help the ones who died. He captures screenshots of these posts and reads them over many times. Beneath land, there is big ocean. Water moves here and there. There is no space for Sagul to breathe. It moves to breathe. This creates waves which shake the land. It's something like the child in the mother's womb before birth. It is due to tectonic plate. Some old people believe that it is a fish that the world sits on or some sort of ghost, but that's wrong. It all depends on the plate. It is because Nepal is inside the Indian plate and the Tibetan plate. If they are joined properly, the earth is fine. I learned this working in Korea. Earth is like flame which was parted from sun once upon a time. Even though the outer temperature of the earth is now less, the inner flame and heat have not yet finished. The vapor from the inner flame is still coming out. When this vapor comes out, earth shakes, like a pressure cooker with the steam. Some say it's like the shell of an egg. We are the shell and the earthquake is the liquid of the egg. It's the earth doing a somersault. These days, people care too much about this Rinpoche or that Rinpoche. A Rinpoche is a Tibetan Lama. This causes disharmony. We have so much envy, anger, such short tempers, we're unsatisfied. It must be for this reason that Nepal experiences such suffering. It's not just in Nepal. These things happen all over the world. Some say it's because people are sinful. There are sins all over the world, so I cannot say it's happened because of sin. What do you expect? It's the Kali Yuga. We live in degenerate times. Guru Rinpoche predicted this. Maybe this year the gods will lose to the demons. For several months under the heat and light of New York summer, Yutok does as his father asks. He makes offerings. He appeases deities of place from a distance. So the reason I wanted to read that in relation to this question is that, so actually all those points of data that are kind of reformulated in a short story as posts that this character is reading actually came from the research that we did, right after the earthquake in Mustang, talking to people. So that's just one example of sort of how anthropology bleeds into fiction, but also some of the ways that people from Mustang kind of made sense of the earthquake and responded to it.
I thank you so much for reading. I think I feel like I should have asked you to read to start us off, but I think it tied together really quite beautifully. I mean, it's interesting. So in the context of Mary's question and then kind of the answer that you gave, I think this is actually quite, I think it segues nicely from Pablo Correa, who asks, do you believe, sorry, one second. Do you believe fiction and realistic fiction will become more popularized as a form of ethnography in the coming years? I feel like there is a tension here, obviously, but something I always felt strange about having studied anthropology is how we often tell other people's stories for them as nonfiction.
Yeah, I think, Pablo, thank you for that question. I think that there is a tension about, and anthropology, I would say, almost any social science or humanities discipline at some level has to grapple with these questions of representation. I would argue most academic disciplines ought to, but anthropology is pretty overt or in some cases too tied up sometimes in self-critique or in kind of which stories can be told by whom, how, why, and I think that those are really productive and important questions. And yet at the same time, I think that part of what fiction and anthropology can do is I would say to shift the ways we have these conversations about storytelling and to think in a slightly different way about who the narrator is and why, and how they are present or absent in the telling of those stories. So, personally, because I think it's more interesting to read and I think it's more interesting to teach with, I would hope that we keep training new generations of anthropologists to write well and to write carefully and to care about how they're telling the stories, whether they're working in their own communities or working in communities that are different from them or different from the worlds in which they grew up. But I do think then this question becomes even more interesting when you start to say, as people like W.G. Siebold or Teju Cole ask us, well, wait a minute, where's the line between fiction and nonfiction? And how do we continue to parse these things? Samir, you've written what you've described as, it's very much a novel, but there are also pieces of it that feel auto-ethnographic, right? Or autobiographical. And so that to me gets to very personal questions about voice and confidence and desire. Where do we want to write from? What kind of place do we want to write from? And to me, I think writing, the ethnography in the book is it's for the most part anyway, first person. And that's in part because I felt like I had to be transparent about where I am in this text. And when someone tries to charge us more for a Jeep ticket in Mustang because I'm there, like that's an important piece of the puzzle to be frank about, right? And yet I can show something else of how I listen or how I pay attention as an ethnographer when I share a kind of inner world presentation or dialogue or experience, maybe in the third person in the course of a short story. So it gets at different forms of knowledge. And so Pablo, I guess my answer simply is I hope that both keep getting done in ways that continue to ask those hard questions and good questions about representation, but that also don't get stopped there, because I think then we're actually limiting our capacity to be truly empathetic and to understand humanity more broadly at a time when we desperately need that, I think.
Yeah. No, it is interesting. I mean, it is, I often wonder why the Sebalds and Teju Coles and the Naipals of the world are the writers that I return to over and over again, right? In some way, and I mean, Cole is all over your book, right? That his presence is, in a very good way, is very
My
kind of
intellectual crush.
yeah, it's very much felt, right? And in some ways, what is this interesting thing, right? Like the kind of same flaneur that Cole is in some ways the same kind of work that ethnography then becomes, less of an issue of kind of what is truth and what is not, but also this kind of idea of how it is that we assess information, right? How it is that we kind of, that these books are interesting, at least partly, is because they are a reflection of the creative process, right? Which is what do you do, when the imagination has been exhausted, right? And what does all that mean? Where does kind of autobiography come in relationship to that? And these are, I think, really interesting questions, which I think you are getting to. This is from Susan Hengen, who asks, how have the lives of people from Mustang in New York changed since you started doing research there?
Thanks for that question, Susan. In so many ways. I mean, first of all, I would say that the people who are in New York have changed, right? So, in 1997, 1998, when I first was actually still living in Nepal, but made a trip home to the US and started meeting people from Mustang who were beginning to come to New York, it was primarily, actually, I think for at least the beginning number of years, almost exclusively men. Many of them married men who had spent earlier moments in their lives being migrants somewhere else, Japan, Korea, other parts of cosmopolitan Asia, cyclic migrations in the winter to India. And so it was, I think the assumption at the very beginning was that this time in New York would be like that. It would be a life stage migration. It would be about, earning money that in ways and at exchange rates that you could never earn through some of these other possibilities for wage labor migration. And that then after 5-6 years, you would return and have enough money to, build a nicer house or buy land in Kathmandu or Pokhara and sort of imagine your retirement there. And of course, over 2 decades, that's completely transformed. And not only are there whole families who have now migrated, but there are generations of Mustang Americans who are being raised in New York. And so that's one way. I mean, I think the other way has then also, one of the other changes is connected to what people do when they get here. And certainly there are still points of continuity. There are a lot of people from Mustang who are nail technicians and babysitters and work as housekeepers, essentially for the most part, white American families or Indian American families, because many from Mustang speak Hindi. And construction workers, and there are tons of many people from Mustang and other Tibetan Himalayan communities work at Whole Foods, and there's a whole question about why that is, but anyway, so jobs have remained, those jobs have remained constant, but at the same time, I know a number of people in sort of the next generation who are teachers themselves, who are real estate agents, who are running businesses, who are accountants, are sort of doing a lot of the things that you might anticipate, or looking at American immigration history, you might anticipate would be the 1.5 or the second generation kind of job. And I think one of the remarkable things really, and something that I'm constantly in awe of really, when I think about how things have changed is, someone, last time I was in Mustang last summer, they said, yeah, we've had 100 years of change in 10 years. And, I think that that's also reflected in some of the issues that have surfaced in New York, as Susan is asking, you know, about how the lives of people have changed. You know, senses of community have also remained really constant in a lot of ways. Tensions between generations have, in some cases, gotten worse or just become different, and that's a function sometimes of language and who's speaking what at home and who's speaking what in their daily life, and can the grandma communicate with the grandkid very well? And again, these are sustained questions across so much immigration history, not just people from Mustang, but I've definitely, you know, seen that. Yeah, they've changed in many other ways, but those are, I would say, some of the key things that I would note. And, you know, education continues to be this really massive driver of all these changes that are both anticipated and not. By the people, by the parents who wanted to create opportunities for education for their kids that then landed them in New York in the end.
There are a whole host of terrific questions, and I don't think I'll try to get through them as much as I can, but this is a terrific question from Wen Dang, who's asking, after spending decades in Nepal, what still confounds you about the place, Mustang, the living and being that happens there and within the diaspora?
It's a great question. A lot, you know, I mean, I think, I don't know if it necessarily is confounding, but it's deeply moving. The ways that people care for each other, especially at the end of life or at the ends of life. And this has been challenged in all sorts of ways for everybody right now with COVID, but I find it miraculous and remarkable and beautiful to watch the ways that people from Mustang actually mark the great transition. And part of that has to do with, you know, Tibetan Buddhism and what Buddhism brings to that moment, but it also has to do with the ways that they are community with each other. The last three women of a much older generation all died within about 3 months of each other, 2 in villages in Mustang and 1 in Kathmandu. And to watch, you know, one was 99, one was just shy of 100, and one was 94. And so they imagined the lives that these women had seen in their lifetime. And to watch the ways that those 3 women were honored, and the fact that they were women and there was space to do this, honored and recognized and mourned, was truly astounding. And again, through all sorts of obstacles and with all sorts of distance. And so again, I don't know if it's so much confounding, but but I would never claim to fully understand what it feels like to be, you know, a family member in that spot. But I know that it was deeply, deeply moving to watch how they did that together as a community and mark the passing of a generation.
This is a question from Fred Kenyon, and it's interesting. So he's asking, considering all the migration currently underway for so many reasons, do you feel the culture you're studying is being diminished in any way, or is it building towards what? And I wonder if you can kind of answer that question, and also then kind of, you know, in some ways, this is this question of culture is, I think, the question that cultural anthropologists, in some ways, deal with the most in its complications, right? So that there's so many canonical books from Gertz to James Clifford that are all about culture and what we think about culture. And so can you talk about kind of the term more generally, how you think about it, how you teach it to your students, and then specifically Fred's question about this notion of what it might mean for a culture to diminish?
Yeah, you know, I think I would resist the idea of diminishment. You know, I think that if I've learned anything from all the years I've been working to maintain relationships and to try to understand Mustang is the creativity, of continuing culture, and also the and this is one way I teach this concept in my classes, is that culture is not monolithic. It is hotly contested. Everybody's going to give you a different definition of potentially what matters to them from the perspective of culture. And yet at the same time, we have these categories like language and religion and, a homeland and these kinds of big picture ideas or songs, right? That shape what we think about when we think about culture. And so certainly there's a lot of change that can and should and ought to be allowed to occur within this framework of culture. And I think where it gets interesting is when, again, people contest which things matter most. And why. And when they get into arguments, or we get into arguments about, or discussions about why one thing matters more than the other, language is really, I would say, a very interesting example here, where, many people from Mustang, they speak, variants of Tibetan, several different variants of Tibetan, and many people feel that or struggle with language being under threat or potentially being lost in the context of diaspora. Whereas other people actually came to New York and learned their dialect in a way that they never got to when they were in boarding school in India. And so, even that question of potential language loss or language transformation is not so much a diminishment, but it's a set of complicated relationships, sometimes trade-offs that come out as people try, again, in their daily lives to navigate what is most important to them, and family pressure too. I mean, family pressure is huge in trying to define which parts of culture matter. Do you have an arranged marriage? Do you have a love marriage? Do you have something in between? These are weighty questions that don't necessarily diminish culture, but that continue to challenge different people's ideas of what one ought to do or how one ought to behave. And I think that, I have deep, deep respect for the younger generations of people from Mustang who are living both worlds and trying to sort this out for themselves and make their, parents happy and live their own lives. And that's the opposite of diminishment, but it's really hard. So, yeah.
Yeah. I thought maybe I could ask you a couple more questions and then we can kind of bring this, unfortunately, to a close. This is a question I think speaks to, a larger set of questions that I think we are all engaged in, right? This is a question from Danelle Moon, who asks, how do you balance the current view to eradicate white colonialism, and how do you teach the concept of anti-colonialism as a white academic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I should turn that question over to some of the folks in the room who I take to New Zealand, and we spend a whole term thinking about that. I think that there are a lot of different ways to answer it, but I would say that the first is to start out by naming the elephant in the room. In other words, don't feel like you have to sort of shy away, no matter what your positionality is, from talking about the difficult stuff. That if we don't actually talk about something like the roots of anthropology as being tied to a colonial project, we end up in a kind of funny place in the end. You try to sort of skip over that. And yet, if we stop with this idea that anthropology is only this one thing, and I'm perpetuating something because of who I am in the world, or what my positionality is, that denies the possibility of continuing to practice the other part of anthropology that I think is really amazing, which is its capacity for radical listening. And from a kind of radical listening, a sense of empathy and a sense of potential interdependence with other human beings that you might not share a lot else with. So, in practical terms, how do I design a syllabus? I'm conscious I pay attention to who I assign people to read. I want to make sure, just like with the concept of Cora, that I'm not only drawing from a certain kind of lineage in how I think about anthropology, but I'm privileging the voices of, indigenous anthropologists or people who are working in their own communities, but also people like myself who are, I'm not Nepali, I never will be, but who have tried to cultivate meaningful ideas about this co-creation of knowledge, that none of us can do it by ourselves, and none of us do it in a vacuum. So those are some of the ways that I approach it. But I think that Zadie Smith actually had this really awesome article in the New York Review of Books a while ago. It was about fiction. It was called In Defense of Fiction, but it was basically about this question of that relates to this question here, and to the endeavor of trying to think about how we keep creativity and imagination alive in a respectful way, and at the same time name those historical and political elephants in the room. Don't shy away from them, but don't make them feel like you can't say anything, because if you get to that point, learning shuts down. And if learning shuts down, it doesn't matter who I am. We're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah. No, it's great. I want to finish with one question, but just to get there, I don't know where it was, but somewhere James Joyce writes that, one of his modes of writing fiction was for him to dislike his characters so that he can engage with them more carefully, right? So that in some ways that liking a character too much prevents you from doing the work that you need to do in order to get to the complexities of that character, right? So with that idea in mind, this is a great question from Ryan Sheen, who asks, I've been really enjoying the discussion, and then he asks, in what ways did your close personal relationships with those you were working with influence your ethnography?
From the root up. I mean, I think that there wouldn't be a book or a project or this whole space for continued growth as a human and as an anthropologist without those relationships. So I guess in that sense, it's not so much that I feel like I need or would ever want to dislike the people that I'm writing about, but rather, so in the way that you were talking about Joyce, but rather to say that I want to understand their complexity. I want to understand how and in what ways they're hypocritical, just like I am, just like we all are, and to see the ways that people change over time. I mean, I think that's one of the other benefits of 27 years of friendship, is that certainly some of those friendships have stayed the same. Some of those people have there's a lot of continuity there, but in other ways, I've watched people go through radical changes, and that's been incredible. And again, sparks more empathy than the desire to sort of want to distance in order to write that fiction.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say very quickly, and I want to turn it over to Mike, is that I disagree with Joyce, right? Like I don't. That is one way of doing it. That there are multiple ways of kind of how you produce empathy, how you produce kind of layers of how you understand a character, occurs in all sorts of different ways. And I think you've kind of laid that out in a really nice way, right? Which is that I think what I've really appreciated about what you have been talking about, right, in these larger conversations, is this notion that, it's almost like you are honest and you own up to what it is that you're doing in order to then move forward with the production of knowledge that you're engaged in, right? That there is, to kind of circle back to that phrase you used earlier, which is to be the co-creator of this knowledge kind of requires that kind of exchange.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Sienna. This was really wonderful. You know, you and I have, of course, you know, known of each other for years, but we have never actually met. So I'm glad we kind of had this opportunity to do that. And Mike, I'm going to let you take it away to close us up. I just want to thank everyone who came, and I want to kind of put up this lovely book one more time for all of you to go by.
And if I could just say two really quick things at the very end here. I know we're a few minutes over. Lakba, I just saw your comment, and you know, thank you for that. Lakba is a friend and one of these folks from Mustang who is navigating so much, and truly, although I hope lots of people read this book, honestly, I really wrote this for you and for your generation. And so it makes me deeply, deeply happy that it matters to you. And I hope that, you know, the next cycle around the Cora is, you know, you figuring out in all the ways that you already do, how you want to keep telling the world what it means to go through the transitions and live the lives that you have. And I use lives plural because you've lived many already, even though you're still fairly young. And also just to say that, you know, I grew up in Santa Barbara. I've been to Chaucer so much over the course of my life. And it's really, really such a joy to be able to launch in the Zoomiverse this book back home. So that means a great deal to me. So thank you, Michael, and thank you, Mari, also for making this possible.
Well, thank you, Samir and Sienna, especially for joining us. Everyone else, please, thank you. Please buy the book, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Bye.